Hi there everyone. So for this video, for the second video for week 7, we're going to be talking about Leibniz's conception of God. And we're going to be talking about this primarily because it really structures like a lot of what he has to say about a number of other topics. I mean, I'm sure we all by this point know that God plays a very important role for, most all of the philosophers of this period. And part of the reason why is because they radically transform and alter the conception of God, as we saw with Spinoza. I saw that many of you agreed with Lessing that Spinoza is not an atheist, but that he only has a modified or changed understanding of God. And so in Leibniz, I hope we'll be able to appreciate a rival conception of God, one that can be competitive with the Spinozist conception of God. It can be very hard to differentiate all of the various features of God because all of these philosophers talk about God and they all talk about believing in God, and they will normally say things like God has all of the perfections and so on and so forth. And so like it can kind of seem like their views are very, very similar, especially if you're like an atheist or something like that. You might just think like, all of this stuff is totally misguided, and so it can be very difficult for you to like keep in your head the hair splitting in many ways between the various different kinds of early modern iterations of God. So that's really what this video is addressed at more than anything else. I mentioned briefly at the end of last video that I hoped also to discuss Leibniz's conception of matter, especially as came out in the conversation of Filarete and Aristide. However, I think I'm just going to have to leave that for next week. Last video just kind of ran long. I apologize for that. Hopefully it was helpful. But we're going to try to keep things short for this video, knowing that your midterm is due at the end of next week. So keeping that in mind, I want to make sure that I'm not overloading y'all as much as possible. So with that in mind, we're only going to be covering one topic today, which is Leibniz's notion of God. And to do that, we're going to have to back up and give a larger sort of like zoomed out summary of different conceptions of God in early modern rationalism as a whole. So we're going to compare Leibniz, we're going to bring out the aspects of Leibniz's view of God that are unique by comparing him to Descartes and Spinoza. Okay. So I have 3 columns here: Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. In each of them, you see that God is, and then we see 3 principal characteristics of God in each of their philosophical systems. And so the most important thing is to go one by one and to be able to see what they have in common with one another, as well as where they disagree. So as you can probably read, if I'm not in the way, right, is just that what unites Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz is that each of them have conception of God as absolute substance. Right. We saw this definition really come out in Descartes' Principles of Philosophy. There, he described God as the only absolute substance, and that finite substances are only used sort of like by analogy with God. We're going to see this idea investigated more by Leibniz next week. But we have in this notion the idea that God is the only absolute substance of the world. This idea then is taken up by Spinoza. Spinoza also maintains God is the sole absolute substance of the world, right? But their conception of what it means for God to be absolute substance are very, very different. Leibniz is going to enter this tradition as well by saying that God is absolute substance. But he's going to agree with some aspects of Descartes' account. He's going to agree with some aspects of Spinoza's account. And he's going to develop some aspects that are entirely original to him. Okay. So we know that what unites all these figures is the belief that God is absolute substance. So let's bring out that idea more. For Descartes, really, to say that God is absolute substance is to say that God is the highest embodiment of all perfection. So really, perfection is the essential idea for thinking about substance for Descartes. And so, to go along with that idea of perfection, Descartes considers humanity to be a kind of perfection, right? The fact that among all of the creatures on the earth, that we are the ones that reason and make decisions and so on, Descartes thinks is a perfection that we have relative to other creatures. And in this way, he's really preserving a very traditional Christian idea that God created humanity in his image. And so God is a person in order to reflect the perfection that exists in us as people, right? We are more perfect in virtue of being persons. So when we imagine the most perfect entity, we have to imagine it as, like ourselves, a person. Okay, so we've clarified the way that God is like ourselves, right? We each embody a kind of perfection that is exhibited in our humanity or in our personality, right? The fact that we reason and make decisions and so on. And so you might then ask, well, how are we different from God in Descartes' account? And the way that we're different from God in Descartes' account is that God is an absolute substance, whereas we are a finite substance. In other words, we're limited by all sorts of crap, right? Other physical objects, other minds, all of these things can limit me. And this is what it means to say that I am not absolute, is to say that I'm limited to something bigger can come and squash me. It's to say that other things can overpower me. My degree of power can be overcome by something with a higher degree of power. God, by contrast, is absolute, and so in principle, nothing could ever overpower God. Nothing could ever force God to do anything. Nothing could ever compel God's decisions. And so a consequence of this view is that while you and me are limited in all sorts of ways, God is not limited. The domain of God's decision is infinite in a way that ours is finite. And so God not only decides what exists and what does not exist, God also decides on the essences of things. And so Descartes believes that God literally creates logical laws. God creates mathematical relations. And as you'll recall from our brief discussion of the doctrine of continuous creation, the only reason that these systems remain the same is because God wills it. God's will is infinite. God's will decides on everything about the universe, and so it even decides on the essences of things, right? God could decide that all the evil things were good and all the good things were evil, and it would be so. God could decide that 2 and 2 equaled 5, and it would be so. God could decide that all of the things that are called imperfect are now perfect, and vice versa, and that is up to the free reign of God's decision. Descartes held this belief that it would be like heretical in some way, to say that God was constrained by, say, logical laws or something like that. Because then God would not be absolute. You would be drawing a limitation to God's power. And so that would be inappropriate for his conception of absolute substance. So, in Descartes, your conception of God is a big man up in the sky. God decides on all of the ways the universe should be. God decides that the universe should continue to exist or not. And all of those are simply, the purview of God's free choice. Nothing could ever compel God. And so the free choice of God, the reign of God, God's ability to make decision without, like referencing anything else as justification, is an essential dimension of God's absoluteness, right? And so God doesn't only decide what is actual, so all the things that exist in the universe, God also decides what is possible. And that is a very difficult notion. So just to give you a little bit of a preview on Leibniz's objection to this idea. Let's back up, actually. Let's talk about Spinoza first. Spinoza's critique of this idea. So, for Spinoza too, God is the absolute substance, right? However, whereas Descartes viewed it as essential to the absoluteness of God's essence, the fact that God embodies all perfections, it was necessary that God was a person. To the contrary, for Spinoza, the absoluteness of God disqualifies God from being a person. Why? Well, because if being a person for Descartes is a kind of perfection, being a person for Spinoza is a reflection of some imperfections, some inadequacies, right? And so even to refer to the decision-making process that Descartes described, what would it be like for God to decide without reasons, right? So like, if God decides on logical laws, on metaphysical laws, what could be God's basis for decision in those cases? Like, why would you choose a logic that is consistent versus a logic that's not consistent, right? That whole idea is extremely, extremely confused, right? It's extremely, extremely confused. What for Spinoza, when we are engaged in the process of making decisions, what this exemplifies is our imperfection, right? We don't know something, we would like to know something, we can only sort of like make hypotheses about it because we have imperfect knowledge, and so we choose to go one way rather than another. We assume one hypothesis and go with it for now. Okay, so then if that is the case, then we shouldn't think about God as going through this decision-making process, because God's eternal. God is not in time or duration, as Spinoza says. God is the order of nature. God is, instead of being distinct from those set of metaphysical and logical laws, is now basically identical to them. God's not a person. God describes the order of absolute substance, which is God/nature, which describes all that is, right? And everything that is, for Spinoza, arises out of necessity. So Spinoza critiques this notion that God can decide on what is possible, because that makes a hash out of the very notion of reasoning or decision making, right? God has to invoke decision. It has to invoke reasons to make a decision one way or another, right? And so this notion that God decides everything on the basis of nothing is completely incoherent, right? There's no way to think about how that is even conceivably possible. And so that must be, Spinoza says, an inadequate conception of God. A conception of God where, we want to be really powerful, so we imagine ourselves as having a whole bunch of power, and then the way that we imagine that is we get to pick and decide on everything. But that idea just doesn't make sense, is sort of what Spinoza's point of view is. And so for Descartes, God is different from the laws of nature. God decides on the laws of nature. For Spinoza, God is those laws of nature. And so God is not different from them and decide on them, just is those laws of nature. And so everything in nature is necessary because of God. Every moment that we think that something is contingent, that it could have been otherwise, right? We are failing to understand how that mode, too, is also an expression of God. Everything about God is absolutely necessary. Modes are just expressions of God. So all modes must also be absolutely necessary. And so for Spinoza, the whole category of possibility and contingency is just out the window, right? It's not real. It only describes ways that we can be confused, right? When we waffle on our decisions because we have limited decision-making capacity, we imagine that things could have been one way or the other. But the reality is the universe is only one way. There is only one universe. And so everything about the universe must be a reflection of God as absolute substance, and like God, be absolutely necessary. And I don't know if I've said this in the past, this might be repeat, but the categories like possibility, necessity, contingency, actuality, these are called modal categories. I'll write that here. Modal. And all that means is, like, are we talking about things that are necessarily the case, that are possibly the case, that are actually the case? It's those distinctions that are captured by this word. These are modal distinctions. So you can see how a modal distinction is at the core of Descartes and Spinoza's conception of God. That for Descartes, God decides what is possible, and so that's Descartes' modal conception of God. Whereas Spinoza says God doesn't decide anything, God just is all that is necessary. And so we have a necessitarian modal conception of God. Okay, so this is where Leibniz comes on the scene. Leibniz agrees with most all of the criticisms that Spinoza makes of Descartes. Leibniz agrees with Spinoza in particular that the idea that God would decide on what is possible is super incoherent. That idea makes no sense at all. And the way that Leibniz conceives of logical laws, of metaphysical laws, of mathematical laws, anything that has to do with essence, and we'll see that he says this in a text next week, he says that they are co-eternal with God. So in other words, like God, these have been true for all of eternity, and that God makes decisions within the framework described by these laws instead of just laying them down, right? Like he is the king or something like that. What Leibniz thinks that the Cartesian picture implicitly does is it makes God irrational. right? God can't give reasons for decisions anymore because God decides on everything. And so you can't give like a justification or anything like that. And so Leibniz thinks that the Cartesian conception actually undermines God. It actually undermines even a traditional Orthodox conception of God. Because, for Leibniz wants to be able to say that God is good. That God, you know, essentially is praiseworthy, that God's design is perfect and wonderful, and that we should be in awe of it. We should be thankful and grateful to be able to live in the world, right? And that Descartes' conception of God makes God so irrational that we can never praise God. We can never think that God's order that was created was genuinely good. We could just kind of hope that he continues to make decisions that will benefit us, right? So this is a crucial distinction between Leibniz and Descartes, is that Leibniz thinks that the Cartesian conception of God, where God decides on what is possible, is incoherent. It just doesn't make sense, right? And it actually kind of leads you naturally to the Spinozistic conception. And so we see that Leibniz sort of refutes Descartes by thinking about possibility, right? Specifically by undermining the idea that God could just choose what is possible, right? And instead saying possibilities are co-eternal with God. How does Leibniz describe what is possible? What is possible is everything that doesn't contradict itself. That's the definition of possibility, right? So square circle, impossible because it contradicts itself, right? Running 500 million light years, that is possible according to Leibniz's conception. It's not actual. It's not something that I could ever accomplish or do, right? But at least theoretically, it's not contradictory. I can at least imagine the notion. I can conceive of a universe in which it could happen, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, and this notion of possibilities as co-eternal with God, and that possibilities are just things that do not logically contradict themselves, this is also the basis of Leibniz's critique of Spinoza. In short, Leibniz also thinks that Spinoza makes a hash of the idea of possibility, right? Because if Descartes made a hash of possibility by making everything possible, right? For Descartes, even the square circle is in a way possible for God, right? God could change the logical laws and make it okay that there are square circles. Nonsense, right? That's just crazy talk. It's hard to understand it in any other way, right? But Spinoza makes an analogous mistake, according to Leibniz. The mistake that Spinoza makes is that Spinoza makes it so that nothing is possible, that only our actually existing world is possible, and that there's no other possible worlds, right? So, like, just think in a very basic way, right? However many minutes ago, if you're watching straight through, 24-ish minutes ago, you decided to start watching this lecture. And, you're people and you live complicated lives, and so there are all sorts of reasons why, like, maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you would go do something else, right? Like, maybe you needed to go to the store or do something like that, right? And so we traditionally think, you could have gone to the store. It was possible for you to have gone to the store, but you didn't actually go to the store, right? It was possible, but it was not actual. But for Spinoza, everything that is actual stems from God, and everything about God is absolutely necessary. So everything that happens in the universe is for him absolutely necessary. And so whenever we say something like you could have gone to the store instead of listening to this lecture, that we are speaking irrationally. We're speaking from the perspective of finitude, right? If we can embody God's perspective, then we can know all of the reasons for why you watched the video instead of going shopping or doing whatever else, right? And so what Leibniz says is, well, this just gets rid of the idea of possibility, right? Possibility just becomes the same thing as our actually existing universe. And this whole, the primary situations that we want to think about this category of possibility for counterfactual situations, so for thinking about things that could have happened but didn't happen, Spinoza claims just basically that all of those instances are illusions, right? And that possibilities aren't real. But if possibilities aren't real, then nothing about our life could have been different. Nothing could have ever changed, right? How could we say that our life is good or bad, or that those concepts have any meaning for us if there's nothing about the universe that we could ever change? There's no possible changes in the universe, according to Spinoza, right? Because God is everywhere and in everything and determines everything, right? And so Leibniz is this incredibly interesting philosopher because he wants to think about and restore the category of possibility and contingency. He wants to say our world is a certain way and it could have been different, right? But the ways that it could have been different are structured, right? So like, there are an infinite number of possible worlds in the sense that the things that you could have chosen to do instead of start the lecture are infinite, right? There's all these different books. You could have read any number of those books, right? You could have went on a walk. You could have blah, 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 right? You can plug in any action that any human being takes essentially in the world, right? And you can say, well, you could have done that instead, right? And so there's an infinite number of possible worlds, but some worlds are not possible, right? So worlds in which there are square circles, not possible, right? And so what Leibniz does through the notion of God, right, is he says that, and this is how he revised the traditional notion of God with keeping this philosophical concept of possibility, is he says that the essence of God is that God is the absolute substance who existed prior to creation, prior to the advent of time, and so is the absolute substance of the universe. And God is, like us, a person. God makes decisions. The only difference between God's decisions and our decisions is their degree of completeness and power. God's being infinite, ours being finite, right? And so, like Descartes, right, God is absolute substance and a person, right? But what changes is the modal characterization of God. Here, God is constrained by the rules for possible universes, right? So there's an infinite number of possible universes, right? But there are no possible universes that are self-contradictory, right? And certain events in universes are, you might say, compossible. They are possible with each other. They are compatibly possible, right? So like the universe where I'm a professional athlete is possible, but it's probably not compossible, right? It's not possible with the world in which, like, I'm a philosopher, for example, right? And so God, in Leibniz's conception, exists before creation. sees all possible universes simultaneously, right? For us, this would be an infinite task. We'd go about calculating, we'd be discovering all of the natures belonging to one universe, discussing their compossibility with one another, moving on to the next universe, right? And it would be an infinite operation. It'd take way too much time. But what describes God's infinite power is that infinite processing power. It happens simultaneously. That's, for Leibniz, almost more than anything else, his conception of God is that God is a machine that operates instantaneously. In other words, God's processing power is such that God can perform infinite calculations simultaneously. And so what's different between us and God, it's not that God reasons in a fundamentally different way than how we do, which is like kind of how Descartes seems to present God sometimes. To the contrary, God reasons in the exact same way as human beings do. The difference is only a difference of degree, that God does it, infinitely faster, infinitely longer equations, right? And the calculation process is different only in that respective degree. It's not different in kind as it is for Descartes. God reasons like we reason. The difference is that God is the best. And so, one of Leibniz's most controversial claims that he ever made in the history of philosophy is Leibniz claims that we live in the best possible universe. So God exists before creation, and God doesn't decide on what is possible, but God does decide on what is actual. And while for Descartes we have no insight into God's decision-making process, because we have no idea what God would appeal to in terms of rules or reasoning or justification, for Leibniz, God reasons exactly how human beings do. And so we can perform limited versions of the calculations performed by God. That is a wild thing to think and say, and incredibly fascinating and interesting for someone who developed the most sophisticated and complex mathematical models of his time, right? He genuinely believed that, like, in the moments where you understand mathematics, right, you are understanding the essential nature of the universe in the same way that God does. The same way, right? That's wild. That is a wild thing that Leibniz believes, and why he thinks that the essence of mathematics is so essentially tied to the essence of philosophical thinking, because it's in mathematical thinking that we can think about pure essences, and in that way reason in a way that is analogous to God. And so God calculates in an instant every possible event that occurs in every possible universe, sees the sum total of the happiness and suffering of all possible universes that could have been created, and selected, because God is perfect and God is good and God is the best and God actually cares about human beings, selected the universe that is the best for all of us to live in. And in the same way that you can give a mathematical calculation for distances or for other things in physics, you can give a quasi-mathematical calculation for what it means to live in the best possible universe. I just find this idea like endlessly fascinating. And Leibniz was mocked for this idea routinely. I mean, it just strikes people as wrong, you know, given how much suffering and so on there is in our world, right? To say that our world is the best world, right? But what Leibniz says is that God, you know, is constrained like us by the rules of possibility. And so it's not like God could, you know, create a non-logical world where everyone could just be happy all of the time or something like that. Instead, the chief philosophical concept, which is also a metaphor that Leibniz uses throughout his Ovoir, is harmony. Our universe is harmonious. And what he means by that is that it is well ordered, it is structured. It's structured in a way that we can rationally comprehend and understand. And it's in that moment of rational comprehension of the universe created by God that Leibniz then says we enter a kind of community with God as rational creatures. So we're not just like mirrors that reflect the universe in that way, right? That's what happens whenever we're purely imaginative or sensible and so on. We reflect the universe, but we don't understand it. In cases of rational knowledge, we understand the universe. And in understanding the universe, we perceive the underlying harmony that belongs to everything that is. And so in that way, we can see the wisdom of God's judgment and exist in God's creation. So like Spinoza, the more you know about the universe, the closer you are to God, because the more you are able to enter into communion with God. Leibniz says you enter the city of God by using reason, right? By thinking rationally about the order of the universe. Because in the same way that God operates with the laws that is possible and decides what is actual, so too when we operate rationally, we are constrained by the laws of possibility, and we can decide only among what is possible to actualize. This video also ran a little long. I apologize for that. There will not be another video this week. Videos next week will be rather short because it is also going to be the due date for your midterm at the end of next week. So yes, I apologize for going long today, but I love Leibniz, and I hope that this material is nonetheless very helpful for you. I will try to keep the video short next week because of your midterm, and I hope that you all have a great week. Okay, bye.